Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
All right, welcome to Meet the Author. Today we're going to be talking to Jeanne Winston Adler. She's written I guess you could call it a true crime book. It's called The Affair of the Veiled Murderess, and it actually has some local connection. It takes place in Troy, New York, a very famous case in 1853. So welcome, Jeanne.
Thank you.
Now this book, we were just talking off the air before we started. Your fascination with this case goes way back
It does.
to the 1990s, but the book finally came out. Now, there's so much to talk about in this book. We have immigration, the place of women, sort of the identity issue, perhaps relations to the Queen. There's a lot to go on here. Why don't we start with the basics? So what got you interested in this case? It's actually a famous case. There's been other books written about it.
Yes.
What made you want to add to this case?
Because the case as it stood made no sense.
With the published versions that people know?
Yes.
Okay.
It was just the story. Well, the part that everybody knows is that in May of 1853, a beautiful woman who was living alone in a small house in North Troy, or perhaps I shouldn't say North Troy, it was Troy proper, but it was the north end of River Street, poisoned two people in a neighborhood bar room there. And then after her, there was a great deal of question as to whether she had actually done it or not.
Yeah.
That was one thing. And then, but more than that, almost immediately, there was a huge question as to who she really was. She was going by the name of Mrs. Henrietta Robinson, and it was very soon known that she was involved with an important Democratic politician, a very wealthy man named John C. Mather. But within actually 2 weeks of her arrest, which followed, I believe, actually the same day or the following day after the murders, this Emma Willard, then principal of the Troy Female Seminary, and already a very famous figure as someone who had initiated academic schooling for girls.
Where was Emma Willard then?
It was right across, it was in what is now Congress Park.
Oh, okay.
It is where the Sage College
okay.
buildings are now. She wrote to the papers to deny that this imprisoned Henrietta Robinson had been a former student of hers, and specifically not one of 4 daughters of the Wood family of Quebec City. And so this was immediately
Now,
this
why
amazing
would Emma
issue.
Willard do that? Were there rumors floating that?
Well, because a rumor actually had been published in a newspaper, and by process of elimination, this account seems to have been published in the Troy Daily Post, a newspaper which within another 6 months would take another name, the Troy Daily Traveler. It was, interestingly, a Whig newspaper, and that's a whole other issue. And that is the party divide, because she was connected with a politician. The party politics of everyone subsequently involved in the trial and afterward becomes very important.
All right. Well, before we get to that, because I know there's a lot to cover, why did my question was, what made you, of the accounts that were published, why did you want to sort of, what was wrong with them, I guess the word, what you were trying to get?
Well, because I just felt that, the main account was this 1855 book written basically at the point when she was going off to Sing Sing, but after her conviction. and this basically supported the idea that yes, this woman was the daughter of this wealthy Wood family, but never gave any explanation as to why she might have committed these murders.
So you're trying to get at the real.
And yeah, and the whole thing was kind of crazy. I couldn't understand what it was. And I thought at that time, the two people who died were recent Irish immigrants.
The two people that were murdered.
Yes, this man, Timothy Lanigan, and a woman who was actually a relative of his wife's, who was visiting from Albany, but who was also, her name was Catherine Luby. She was a young woman, and she was also a recent Irish immigrant. And somehow, maybe by fairly early on, I realized that Mather was, in addition to many other horrible characteristics.
Just back up a second. Just mention who that is, the major player here, the murderess.
The murderess, and then then another major player in the whole case was her lover,
who was
this
a famous
man
politician.
who was a very powerful politician. And in fact, in 1852, he had already been spoken of as a possible Democratic candidate for governor of the state. I mean, he was like a major person. But he belonged to one particularly nasty wing of the Democratic Party then. He was what was called a hard Democrat, which mostly meant he was a pro-slavery guy. And the roots of this are easy to see. He had, before he became involved in political activities, he had a wholesale business which sold supplies to cotton manufacturers, because Troy, in addition to iron, it was a big place of textile mills, and it tended, people in the North who were sympathetic towards slave owners tended to be people who were involved in industries that had to do with cotton.
All right, so right from the...
But anyway, but in addition to being sort of pro-slavery, I mean, he's the man you love to hate. He also was sort of a nativist. He was kind of not too good on the Irish and German immigrant question. I mean, not too good on this. You pick up through some slight things, but anyway. So I thought, gee, you know, here's this woman who's the mistress of a nativist politician, you know, and then the people that she poisons are these two recent Irish immigrants. I thought, you know, maybe there's something weird there. You know, maybe this is something to do with this. But that turned out to be completely wrong. That had nothing to do with it.
At the time, though, was this from all the newspaper accounts you did research on, there's tons of quotes in here from all the newspapers at the time.
Yes.
It was this sensational trial.
Yes, it was. But you see, before you get to the trial, what's really interesting is, and none of this appears in the 1855 book, before you get to the trial, some of the first news reports talk about a quarrel between this woman and the Lanigans. And the quarrel essentially was this, that she had moved to that area in the spring of 1852. It was a time of like great movement and change, and this whole area had only recently become like a separate ward because of the tremendous population growth. And what was I going to say? The
two people that she killed.
Right. They had only moved there a few months after she had too. And she first had very friendly relations with them. She had a good bit of money. She lived in this comfortable house. They were running a little grocery store and bar, catty-cornered opposite to where her house was. And then by the early spring of '53, the neighborhood had sort of realized that she was a, quote, fallen woman, that she was not a respectable widow or a respectable married woman.
Did they know who she was the mistress of?
I don't know. Maybe they didn't really know. I don't know whether they knew or not. But she, but in any case, they had turned against her and were in the process of actually trying to drive her out of the neighborhood. And
for being a, quote, fallen woman?
And this was quite common in antebellum cities. In fact, there is a man who did another, a book also from, maybe it wasn't from SUNY, I think it was Norton, Timothy Guilfoyle, City of Eros.
Okay.
And he has written about this at length, how women who were courtesans or prostitutes or living irregular lives were very open to community attacks at this time. There really was no police force. I mean, there was like a night watch, and then there were, for Troy, which at this time, counting West Troy on the other bank, had 30,000 people. There was something like 30 constables in the daytime. I mean, so there was like no police.
So right from the beginning, this story has got sex, politics, and a class sort of class system.
And then, amazingly, in addition to sex, politics, it also has like insanity, because there was all this charges about after this happened, well, her lawyers, and she had this amazing, I mean, talk about modern day trials. She had like 5 lawyers. She had this battery of lawyers defending them, all of whom were, except one, were hired by Mather to keep his name out of the proceedings.
Okay.
But the one who was not hired by Mather, and seems actually simply to have been hired by Robinson herself, unless, because this man was, this lawyer, Martin Townsend, was a political enemy of Mather's, he may just have offered his services so as to have a good opportunity of blasting Mather in the trial, which he did.
Well, where does the veil come in?
Oh,
tell us
that's the other thing.
Well, before you
can see why I have to write, because I cannot verbally tell a coherent story. So this is why it was very good for me to write it all down, write chronologically, and go right through. What happened was, I think basically kicked off by Emma Willard's letter, within a couple of weeks of her imprisonment, she began wearing, Henrietta Robinson began wearing a heavy veil over her face, even within her jail cell.
So in the cell and in the trial every day, she wore the...
Yes, and she wore, at the trial, you know, she had a bonnet, and then this veil, which, unlike the glamorous veil on my cover illustration, which I love, was not a veil that could be seen through. It was really more like a cloth. So she was really quite invisible. And the judge would periodically make her raise her veil to show her face to witnesses, but then she would immediately cover up again. And in a way, this was kind of condoned by the judge and the prosecutor. I mean, they sort of let her do this. But anyway.
Well, a big aspect of the book, of the story, is the Veiled Murderess, her identity.
Right.
And I know you go into it in the book, but it seems like, from what I've read, I have to admit I didn't read the whole thing, but it seems like the identity of this woman almost superseded whether she committed a murder or not.
No,
why was her identity, which you can talk about, why were people so obsessed with, was she an earl's daughter, or was she a plumber? Why was this identity thing so...
Because, well, for several reasons, but it had to do with people's current preoccupations about women and the role of women, and there was a great issue. Even at this time, as late as the 1850s, there were many people who felt that women's education was very dangerous and could overtax women's brains, lead to crime, insanity, you know.
Just for being educated.
Yes. No, I'm serious.
Okay.
And so this was an issue. Then there was also sort of the issue of like ladyhood. Could a woman who had been gently raised, a lady, could she be guilty of this? And basically the answer from everybody was yes, because though this was the time when, do you know that, well, Coventry, Patmore, and all those pieces, this was the time of bringing up the idea of Victorian womanhood as being angelic, and in some ways women were purer and better than men. But really, this was sort of a front that basically this period, the 1850s, was a time of great misogyny, in which there was great suspicion of women, and brought about probably by the fact that this was because of the beginning of the industrial era. I mean, theoretically, the industrial era had begun in the 1820s, but it really sort of hit the fan here in the 1840s and 50s. And because people's lives were being changed so much, because work no longer took place within the household, with a master craftsman and his apprentices and also his family, his wife and children working under his patriarchal supervision, and because work had now been displaced into factories away from the home, and because young men, clerks and apprentices at this time were seen as very sort of unruly, alarming forces. I mean, it seemed very unnatural for young men to be outside the sort of familial supervision.
Well, in the beginning of the book, you paint a vivid picture of the Troy in the 1850s, all this industry, hustle,
oh yeah,
bustle,
no, it was an
markets,
amazing place. I mean, and it was so colorful, and the Troy directories of these years just paint this amazing picture of all this, because of being right at the point on the Hudson where the Erie canals and the Champlain canals exited. And so anyway, so it was this time of just amazing growth, amazing change. Well, this comes, I guess I was going on too long about the apprentices and the clerks, but basically people saw this change in society, as well as this huge inrush of people born in foreign countries, and particularly Catholic Irish and Catholic Germans, many of them coming to Troy at this time.
So who were some of the people, or I should say some of the people, what were some of the speculations about Marion Robinson's identity, who she possibly could have been? What were some of the things people...
Oh, okay. Well, actually, you see, they started out with the Wood daughter, but they started out with Georgiana Wood. That's the first one mentioned, the eldest. Then by the time of the trial, they had moved to Emma. She was the second eldest. And then they didn't get to Charlotte Wood until the early...
So she was thought to be one of these daughters at each time.
Yeah, no, and it would sort of be, the first one would be disproved, and then they'd go to the next one. The only trouble with and then the Charlotte Wood one was kind of, that was the allegation put forward in the 1855 book. Okay. By that time, that was and in certain ways, you see, this is terrible. I, like a fool, half of my research, even after I had discovered these death certificates in Scotland, I kind of think, well, well, maybe she really was, because her brother kept coming down from Canada, making all these denials. And the more you deny something, the sort of guiltier you look. And then in addition...
But she just gave her name as Marion Robinson. She didn't say...
Well, Henrietta Robinson.
I'm sorry, Henrietta Robinson.
Yes.
That was all she would say. Or...
Yes, I'm Mrs. Henry. Though, that's the other thing. If... she was a tremendous liar.
Okay.
She, at different times, she lied about husbands, about people she knew, and according to one allegation that she had been living in Albany in 1851, when there, allegedly, she had told someone that she was the daughter of an Admiral Pakenham from Ireland. And this,
So you got that one, and you got the Wood brother visiting, and...
but the thing is, by going through this mass of crazy evidence, starting from the beginning, from the murders, going through the trial, then through all the newspaper coverage that followed, through everything that followed, including a supposed classmate of hers from Emma Willard, who comes forward in the 1890s to say that yes, she had visited Robinson in Sing Sing in 1871, and yes, this was her dear classmate, and all this. By going through everything, you can see absolutely that she was not this wealthy girl, and that this story suited the politicians who had actually been involved with Henrietta Robinson, who may have, or it could be just Mather, but it's more likely she was involved with more of them, that it seems extremely likely that Henrietta Robinson was a woman who had committed a rather serious crime in Albany in 1851, then going by the name of Susan Gaynor, and that was the reason that she left Albany to come to Troy, because Mather still had his position as canal commissioner then, and still had an office, and was living in Albany. There was no reason for her to be living in Troy, but she had this huge legal problem, and that.
What was that crime in Albany?
A manslaughter.
Oh, okay.
In which, under the influence of alcohol, she had thrown a log out a second-story window, and it had hit somebody and killed them.
Well, one thing in your book...
it's all rather fantastic. But anyway, so this clearly false allegation, the Wood daughter allegation, suited the politicians who had been involved with her, and I think they fostered it. But it also psychologically suited newspaper readers and just the public at large.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you next. In your book, you mention reading the old newspapers. You say that the reporters of the 1850s weren't too thorough. And you read all these accounts. I mean, how many papers were in Troy then?
Oh, okay. Well, the best paper, the paper I adored, was the Troy Daily Times, which was considered an independent paper. At that time, most of the papers were, though actually it was a soft, the Democrats were the softs and the hards, and the Whigs were the silver grays and the woolly heads.
And did they all have their own paper, kind of?
Yes, though actually Troy just had a conservative Whig paper, a silver gray Whig paper. That was the Troy Daily Whig. Then the liberal, that's not true. There was the liberal Whig paper was the Troy Daily Traveler, and the soft Democratic paper, both the Budget. The Troy Daily Budget and the Troy Daily Times were basically Democratic.
Did they all write about the trial?
Yes.
And then did you find in your research, you were saying
They treated it very differently. Yeah.
So that must have been difficult.
Well, no, but you see, that was the way into it.
Oh, okay.
If you could sort of identify who was, pushing what story.
Yeah. Okay.
And basically, what happened was, after the initial appearances of this Wood daughter allegation in the Whig papers, after the initial appearances in papers which, because Troy did not have a hard Democratic paper, the Whig papers were the papers that were friendly toward Mather. After the initial appearance of this rumor there, after the trial, and when Martin Townsend had basically just done a job on Mather's reputation by talking about his, though Townsend was basically pushing, though without using the name Wood, he was basically pushing this view of the woman's identity. After that point, it is the Democratic papers that pick up the Wood allegation and just run it and run it and run it.
Well, I'll tell people at this point, this is a long, involved story. If you want to hear the whole thing,
yeah.
Jeanne's going to be here at our library on Thursday night, April 7th. This show's going to be on both before and after, but she's going to be here on Thursday night, April 7th at 7 o'clock, talking about the book and all these complications.
No, well, and at that point, I'll have organized myself
Okay.
to speak about it in a much more
Well, the book
organized way.
also has some nice little, I guess you call them etchings, sort of Currier and Ivish, but there's a lot in here. The book kind of looks almost like a 19th century.
Well,
book
because they're
publication. Yeah,
yes, they're
they got the
taken
little-
from the newspapers.
Well, let's see. Before we end, a few other things I'll talk about. So this is the affair of the Veiled Murderess, the famous trial in Troy, 1853. Again, Jeanne will be here in April 7th, Thursday night at 7 o'clock. Talk about it. I'll just mention your other books because the library owns all your books.
Oh, thank you.
Early Days in the Adirondacks, the photographs of Seneca Ray Stoddard, a very famous photographer of the Adirondacks. In fact, I've looked at this book many times in the library, and now I can meet the author.
He was a wonderful
And
photographer.
I think PBS did a special on him, didn't they, once?
They did.
So,
they did.
and these
because-
are very famous pictures of the Adirondacks. Probably it's a really nice book if you like the Adirondacks. Again, very famous
And
photographer.
he has a Troy connection.
Oh, it's a Troy connection too?
Because
Okay.
he trained as a painter in Troy.
Okay, and then that's one of Jeanne's books, and her other book, and then you can ask her about any of these if you come on the 7th, but Chainbreakers War, a Seneca chief remembers the American Revolution. Jeanne, explain how you
I'm just the editor of
You're the editor,
Yeah,
but,
of it. It's an authentic narrative, an amazing
but
narrative.
you sort of, I don't want to say translate it, but it was an Indian narrative in this pidgin English that you just kind of
Right.
put into.
It was transcribed by Chainbreaker himself was just a Seneca speaker. He did not speak English.
Oh, okay.
But he gave this narrative to a fellow Seneca who had kind of very fractured English. And so my work was just to go through and put a sort of standard English syntax onto it to make it readable.
Well, I think a lot of people forget that we live in a very historical area, particularly for the Revolutionary
Oh, yes.
era.
No,
And then
I
your other
know.
book here, it's in our children's room, but it looks like it's more like, probably goes up to like 8th grade level. In the Path of War, Children of the American Revolution Tell Their Stories. Are these
Well,
from
actually,
original?
I'll tell you, these are wonderful, and really, in a way, it was just picked up by a children's history publisher,
Oh, okay.
Cobblestone, and so they marketed it
Did you take
to
writings
young
from
people.
kids back then?
No, what this was another fantastic thing. The town where I live, Salem in Washington County, there was a doctor there, Dr. Asa Fitch, who was incidentally a rather famous scientist, a naturalist. He did a lot of in fact, he's considered one of the fathers of American entomology, which is
Okay,
insects.
yeah.
But he, in the 1840s, he was a doctor. He interviewed elderly patients and people living in the town, and then wrote down verbatim in their words, you know, they were saying, I did such accounts of what had happened to them during the Revolutionary War. And at that time, they were children
Okay, so you took it from
or
that.
young teenagers. And he then put this material with a lot of other material in this gigantic manuscript that's so huge that it's not indexed. It's very hard to wade
you
through.
just took excerpts.
I took out the good first-person statements.
Well, people love first-person accounts.
Oh no, I do too. I adore
particularly
it,
from that
yeah.
time. And this book, The Affair of the Veiled Murderess, there's a lot of excerpts from newspapers from the 1850s.
I know, because I love that
They're
too.
very, and it's
Yeah.
long excerpts. It's very interesting to read how they wrote back then. But the story is long and complicated, so if you want to hear the rest,
But
this is a library book. You can come and check it out, but you'll have some for sale. when
But
you come.
yes, but very scandalous and very shocking.
Well, when you have sex and politics and the class system, you're bound to have a good story.
Yes.
And so that's April 7th, Thursday night here in the library, although the show will be on before and after, Jeanne Winston Adler's new book, and we'll see you next time on Meet the Author.